It is always a pleasure to host these events on campus, and it's wonderful to see such a turnout in a vibrant community like ours. So again, our thanks, and it is our pleasure to do this evening. Without further ado, Dean Nakai to introduce our speaker, and my personal thanks for him being here.
Good evening and welcome. We are delighted to have you with us. I am privileged to introduce to you Dr. John Entelis, our speaker for this evening's Jacobson Global Lecture Series. Dr. Entelis is a professor of political science and director of the Middle East Studies program at Fordham University. He received his PhD from New York University and studied Arabic in Cairo, Harvard, and Princeton. A distinguished scholar, Dr. Entelis is one of the leading experts on the politics of Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. His numerous publications on the politics of North Africa and the Middle East have enriched scholarship in the United States and abroad. Dr. Entelis consults for various private and public institutions, including the United States Department of State, PBS, ABC, CBS, CNN International, and the New York Times. He is editor-in-chief of the Journal of North African Studies and publications officer of the American Institute for Maghreb Studies. Beyond his scholarly pursuits, Dr. Entelis is an excellent educator and a very popular professor. On February 3rd, at the Arts and Science Faculty Day, he was awarded the Social Science Award recognition for excellence in teaching by his colleagues and students. Congratulations. We hope this program will stimulate an intelligent discourse on the role of the United States in the international scene. At the conclusion of his talk, Dr. Entelis will entertain questions from the audience. We would like to remind all of you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please, let's welcome Dr. Entelis.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredibly warm and hospitable introduction, and I thank you all, Dr. George and Ellen, for the organization of this lecture. What I'm going to talk about tonight, and I want to give a lot of time for questions and answers. Often that's a time when the most interesting debates develop. But what I want to do, having just come back from a week of lecturing and meeting officials and others in Tunisia, I want to look at the case of Tunisia in the context of what the topic of tonight's lecture is about, which is the impact of the Arab Spring and the consequence role of political Islam in the post-revolutionary period, not only in Tunisia, but elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. I will expand on the Tunisian experience as it has affected the other countries in the area, especially Egypt, but some others as well. Now, why Tunisia? Most people, I think, before what we would call the Intifada, before the events that led to the overthrow of the incumbent dictator Ben Ali in Tunisia, very few people had an idea of where Tunisia was. And to the extent that they were at all aware about the Middle East and North Africa, they probably would be more familiar with Egypt, of course, and even Libya, not necessarily for good reasons, mainly for bad, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, and so on and so forth. Tunisia was a kind of backwater country that doesn't have oil, doesn't have gas, has no particular geostrategic significance, 40 miles from the Sicilian coast, population of about 10 to 12 million, highly educated, highly modernized, long tradition of a interaction both with the South and East and West, but also with Mediterranean Europe. Indeed, Tunisia's own political evolution is very distinctive from its neighbors. If one looks at Algeria to its west, this is a country that was colonized by the French for over 130 years, and part of Algeria was itself annexed into France and became part of France. Tunisia never had that experience. The French did come in 1881, they were eventually left in 1956, but that colonial experience was relatively moderate and non-violent. And this is going to be important in trying to understand how this revolutionary political movement emerged and how it is manifesting itself today. So a country with a history of non-violent contestation against those that occupied it. In this case, this was the French. But in other countries where Europeans colonized, the British in Egypt, let's say, or the French in Lebanon, and the French in Algeria and Morocco and so on, where there was a great effort on the part of the colonizer to alter the nature of these countries and modernize them along a particular Western path of development. Tunisia, in fact, initiated its own development under its own auspices with intellectuals and elites that had been educated in Tunisia. When the French came, they didn't leave the kind of negative impact that colonialism has historically been associated with the Middle East. After independence, Tunisia, with a country that has few resources, the government was led by what everyone would still call the founding father of modern Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba. Habib Bourguiba was the leader of a political movement that fought for independence against the French, gained independence, and then he became the president of the country at independence in 1956. And the view he had of Tunisia, and if you think about the period, he comes into power in 56, and he actually stays all the way until there's a coup d'etat in 1987, in which the Ben Ali, who is the dictator who was ultimately overthrown, essentially overthrew Bourguiba. But the period in which Bourguiba was president was also the time when in the Arab world there were contesting views of how the Arab world should develop. And on one hand, you had Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who came to power in 1952. And he represented one particular vision of how the Arab world would go forward. And it was highly nationalistic, highly socialistic, internationalist, with a strong association with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Bourguiba, on the other hand, viewed Tunisia as much more of a moderate, pro-Western country that wanted to, in a way, represent the best of both the East and the West and the North and the South. He himself had been educated in France. He was a lawyer. His first wife was a French woman. So he came to Tunisia with a very strong influence of Western education and values. And he sought to develop Tunisia along those lines. And for the most part, he was successful. By that, if we look at literacy levels, educational levels, social development, the status of women. The status of women in Tunisia, even to this day, represents among the most advanced of any country in the region, among the most advanced in the world. Because in 1957, a family code was passed under the auspices of Habib Bourguiba that gave women the rights of equality that didn't even exist in the United States. And that included almost everything, including alimony, child custody, the ability of women to travel without the permission of their father or their husband or their brother, and so on and so forth. Very advanced. This women's family code is still in effect. So whether it had to do with women, healthcare, education, literacy, and social development, the regime of Habib Bourguiba invested in human capital in the absence of natural resources that other countries would utilize for their development. So the picture seems, quite promising, and the models seemed quite appealing. And as a result, of course, you can imagine that countries like the United States and France and others in Europe very much identified with Bourguiba, particularly if he was being compared to Nasser, who was viewed much more as hostile to American and Western interests. The problem actually began when the ability of the regime and the leader to understand the need that to the extent you begin to educate your population, to the extent you begin to provide health services, to the extent that you begin to make people socially, economically, and ultimately politically conscious of who they are or what they are, there's an inevitable demand, a universal demand, that social and economic opportunity leads for demands for political opportunity and for political freedoms and for democracy, if you want to use that term. That relationship has been one of the most difficult relationships for incumbent leaders in the Middle East and North Africa to understand even to this day. Because while Bourguiba was one outstanding example of successful social and economic development, others were doing the same kinds of things, maybe not as successfully. Even Nasser, whatever we may have thought of him in terms of foreign policy, he was, if you look statistically what he was doing for the Egyptians in terms of education, literacy, healthcare, and so forth was improving significantly. So this notion that if you invest in human capital and expect that people will not at some point develop a level of political awareness and political consciousness in which they would then expect and demand that their voices be heard, that concept was somehow not understood, not appreciated, ignored, or whatever it is. So in time, Bourguiba lost a great deal of political legitimacy as he became increasingly authoritarian in the way he maintained himself in power. This is quite familiar to you if you're familiar at all with Eastern Europe, if you're familiar with the notion of authoritarianism almost anywhere, and why does authoritarianism ultimately get overthrown. Now, the reason this is important in the context of what I'm talking about today is that among the groups of people who felt somewhat left out or marginalized in this process were many of the Tunisians in the interior. This is a very small country. Most of the population lives along the coast, highly homogeneous, all Sunni Muslims, ethnically homogeneous. You don't have linguistic differences, you don't have ethnic differences, you don't have religious differences, and you have a great deal of regional cohesion as well. The difference comes with the interior as opposed to the coastal areas. And in the interior, where birth rates remain quite high, by the way, just to give you an example of the advancement of Tunisia in terms of social development, Tunisia today has a birth rate that is under 1%. This is one of the lowest in the world, nothing to say about the third world. But this is a process that Bourguiba initiated. So what was developing is that there was a clear class conflict, divisions emerging between a middle-class, Western-oriented coastal Tunisia and a more conservative, traditional, and Islamic-oriented interior. And in that interior, ultimately, Islamic movements, tendencies, not of a political nature, of a social welfare nature, began to appeal to many people who felt disenfranchised, alienated from what they increasingly saw as a culture to which they couldn't identify. Francophone, highly Western, secular, to such an extent that Bourguiba almost wanted to eliminate many of the required ritual practices of Ramadan, such as not eating during daytime hours, and he wanted to break that. He didn't succeed, but that to show you the extent to which he believed that Tunisia could go forward as a Western-style nation at the expense of Tunisia's heritage, culture, religious identity. So what began essentially as a cultural, social, and economic movement, welfare movement, Islamic movements that began to cater to the people who felt disenfranchised and marginalized, over time grew into a movement of enormous popular and political support. To such an extent that by the 1980s, you had a movement that was called the Islamic tendency movement that reflected this segment of the population, which was increasing in size and was also increasingly moving into urban areas. So you had a phenomenon that's quite common in this part of the world of over-urbanization but under-urbanism. So people moving from the countryside lacking the requisite skills to succeed in urban environments, educational skills, cultural, other cosmopolitan characteristics we associate with urban living. So over time, this Islamic tendency, which had been building up from the bottom and responded to people's immediate needs, was transformed into a political movement that increasingly represented, if not the majority, a good percentage of Tunisian people. So you can imagine, as this movement emerged, the secular elites that had taken over at independence, under Bourguiba and then later under Ben Ali, saw this as a threat to their authority. And the elites surrounding the leadership, which was highly francophone, highly secular, highly pro-Western, also felt threatened. As a consequence, this movement was banned, made illegal. And its leader, Rashid Ghannouchi, who now is a name that people have heard of, and someone who I've gotten to know myself personally, who came to Fordham University 20 years ago, and I interviewed him in my office. He was the head of this MTI. When Ben Ali first came to power, responding to the increasingly dictatorial manner of Bourguiba, he opened up the system, liberalized it, and people actually believed that this was going to be the new beginning of Tunisia. So it's interesting how when we witnessed what happened in 2010 and 2011 in Tunisia and how hated this man was, that when he initially came to power, he was viewed in very, very positive terms. And among the things he did was to sort of begin to negotiate with the Islamists, saying, well, listen, you know, we can't put you in jail anymore, we can't have your members thrown in prison and so forth. And they even went so far as to hold the first ever in the country multi-party local elections. And the results of those elections showed that the Islamists were the ones that got the most votes. That scared the living hell out of the governing elite, and they immediately shut it down, immediately threw him, Ghannouchi, into prison. Ultimately, he left the country and lived in self-imposed exile in London all these many years until he just got back in January of 2011. So you see the origin of a movement that is not explicitly religious in character. And for those of you who have studied Islam, understand that Islam, much more so than even Judaism and Christianity, is a totalistic, all-encompassing faith that in the origin of the religion itself under the Prophet Muhammad had never made a distinction between that which is diplomatic, that which is political, that which is economic, and that which is religious. So this unity of belief in the way that Muhammad was able to mobilize the tribal people of the Arabian Peninsula to assume the incredible strength that they were able to, within 100 years, being able to go all the way up to southern France and defeat the Europeans, could only have been possible through the utilization of these multiple sources of political, economic, military, as well as religious means. So that the ability of someone like Ghannouchi, who maintained his fidelity to Tunisia, he remains first and foremost a Tunisian nationalist. You know, when I conclude, I want to sort of generalize about what this political Islamic movement, not only in Tunisia but in the area as a whole, ends up being. But to show you why Tunisia is important, is that it reflected first and foremost that this was a Tunisian movement. It wasn't a pan-Islamic movement. This is not Al-Qaeda. This is not bin Laden. This is about nationalist Tunisians dissatisfied with the discourse and the manner in which Tunisia was developing through the secular Western Francophone model that Bourguiba brought to Tunisia. So Ben Ali shuts them down. He goes into prison, while all other discontented groups in Tunisian society, and there were many that were developing, for the reasons I've indicated. What happens when you educate Tunisian students? What happens when they become lawyers, and they become journalists, or they become doctors, they become dentists, they become teachers? Do they just shut off the world? Do they close off everything about politics and international life? Not at all. And Tunisian society, by the way, is, as I said, given the social and economic development over time, is a very modern society in the sense of how it sees itself. And it's reflected many other ways, by the way. There's a great deal of tourism, a great deal of travel between Tunisia and Europe, has for a long time, and so forth. So they understood the paradox and contradiction between a high level of social economic development and an incredibly low level of political opportunity and development. But they couldn't do much about it. This was a police state. Though the military was never big, when you think of Egypt, for example, never a large military, its security service was incredibly enormous and encompassed hundreds of thousands of people. Every time you got into a cab in Tunisia, you get out of the airport, you get in a cab, you want to go to Sidi Bou Said, which is this resort area outside of Tunis, you know. Every cabbie is an informant. Every cabbie was an informant. Oh, so you think, you know, gee, these Tunisians are friendly. Where are you from? Oh, the U.S. Oh, yeah, where are you staying? Oh, who do you know? So you're answering typical American friendliness, you know. Ask a question, I'll give you an answer. And only later on, it dawns, this guy's, you know, racking up all this information. And every foreigner that came into the country that would hop on a cab, and if that wasn't done, then it was your bellboy. And if that wasn't done, then it was the guy who took you to the souk to, you know, buy carpets and so on and so forth. So what an incredible network of informants that this system had. And the reason this is so amazing, you know, for those of us who've been studying and writing about Tunisia all these years, we ended up concluding that this is like the most robust authoritarian state that will never collapse. Ha ha ha, another academic goes down the tube with predictions. That's why academics are academics and, you know, policymakers are policymakers. So, but the reason we said it is, well, listen, you know, it's a small country. They have a great highway system, great communication system. They've got this incredible informant system. They're wealthy enough to keep people more or less happy. People can travel and so on and so forth. Say, my God, they've got the formula to maintain this forever, forever. At the same time that the regime itself and the leader Ben Ali and his family were becoming increasingly corrupt. The system was crony capitalist through and through, and he himself and his family were despised by almost everyone, even by those who you would have thought would have been supportive, the Francophone elite, the Western-oriented, well-educated, living along the wealthier towns along the Tunisian coast. They were against him. When I would go see my... So you know, over the years, you would develop contacts. So Ghanouchi would be my friend, but also Hamma Hamami, who's the head of the Communist Party, was my friend. And everyone in between. And they all hated him. You know, I said, whoa, you know, this guy is really unpopular. But of course, you know, he lived in this bubble of sycophants around him, making him think that he was God and everything was going well. Now, having laid this out, you know, it's clear that we who studied Tunisia felt that this could not be maintained. And the reason we believe that is, well, look at what happened to Eastern Europe. Isn't that what happened to East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Hungary? Didn't people get a level of education, political awareness, that ultimately the gap between the manner of political authoritarianism and the level of economic and social development was such that the contradiction was, you know, wasn't sustainable? So why wouldn't it happen in Tunisia? So many of us predicted that this couldn't last. What we couldn't predict is when and how. And I don't think anybody could. Because when Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire in Sidi Bou Said, which is one of these small interior towns, you know, about 50 miles due west from the second largest city in Tunisia, Sfax, he hadn't been the first to commit suicide in that manner. There had been many others before him. So why wasn't there a revolution there? Why didn't it happen? I mean, this to me, when I'm lecturing on this to any audience, I simply say that's the X factor, okay? We're still dealing, you know, we're not hard scientists. And even the term social science, I think, is a fraud. Let's just say we're looking at human behavior. You can study and understand human behavior up to a certain point. And so to me, it's not surprising that there would be this X factor of a man committing suicide through self-immolation, leads to this incredible upsurge of mass mobilization of Tunisians, which in a matter of weeks, if not days, the regime collapses. Ben Ali gets on a plane and goes to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where he still is with his family. What's interesting in all of this is when the mass movement of opposition began to gain strength, it was not led by Islamists. It was led by youth. It was led by men and women. It was led by people in the countryside, people in the cities. But you didn't see any, you know, overt symbol of Islamism. You didn't see any comments or criticisms of the US. You didn't see anything about Israel. Yes, there were placards about Palestine, but most of it was about justice, dignity, freedom, and jobs, but for most of Tunisians, the two were inseparable. After the revolution, Ben Ali leaves, and now you have the process of reconstituting a new government. And the Tunisians, unlike the Egyptians, for those of you who've been following what's happening in Egypt, have already accomplished a lot. There's been an election for a constituent assembly. This assembly is given the task of writing a new constitution and setting up this next set of legislative elections. So what we have now is a constituent assembly, elections have taken place, and who won the most seats? Oh, not the majority of seats, but the plurality of seats were the Islamists, whose name was changed afterwards from the Islamic tendency movement, using the French acronym MTI, to Al-Nahda, Al-Hizb al-Nahda, which is the party of Renaissance. And this Al-Nahda party has become the most important, influential political movement in the country today. Of the 41 cabinet seats in the current government, that's still in transition, 30 of them are held by Al-Nahda members, and in very key positions: education, religion, foreign affairs, and so forth. Now, having just come back from Tunisia, I wanted to see what was the outcome of a number of what would appear to be conflicting tendencies, cultural, political, and otherwise. One is, what happened to the secular westernized elites that had evolved under the previous regimes? Two, how were the Islamists responding to the insecurities and uncertainties of these secular elites, that all the benefits, including, we may think it's shallow on their part, but they want alcohol. Yeah, we want to go to a bar and we want to have booze. We're worried they're going to take our liquor away. And you go say, guys, you got more important things on your mind, right? No, but Tunisia has no oil and gas, okay? Its most important export is olive oil, okay? And its other most important source of foreign earnings is tourism. Tourism is essential for the Tunisian economy. The overwhelming number of tourists come from Europe. And Tunisia has long been known as a popular destination, admittedly for low-end charter tourists, but nevertheless an important source of income. So to the extent that the images in Europe of Tunisia was one of Islamists coming to power, the possibility that Sharia law was going to be the basis of the new constitution, this is Islamic law, the possibility that women and men would be separated in, let's say, classrooms, the possibility that bikinis wouldn't be allowed, the possibility is that bars would be closed. So you're sitting in, Frankfurt, a lot of German tourists, and you're watching this on TV. So I think I'll go to Greece, or I think I'll go to, Sicily or something like that. And the impact has been very visible. Enormous impact on the Tunisian. So there's real consequences to this issue. This is not just simply one of cultural or ideological difference. So one hand is what's going to happen to the secular elites? Secondly, what are the Islamists going to do on these various issues? And thirdly, most importantly, is in the wake of the Islamist victory, which I still consider politically moderate, they have long argued that Islam and democracy are inherently compatible. We can get into this if you want to get into a discussion. There's theses written on this. And as you can imagine, in America and elsewhere, this remains a contentious issue. The Bernard Lewises of this world and others, Daniel Pipes, argue that Islam and democracy are inherently incompatible. And they'll give you a whole slew of reasons why. On the other side, the John Espositos and John Vole, among others, will argue that Islam and democracy are fully compatible. Well, the Ranushis of this world argue on the compatibility of the two, and they want to demonstrate that, in fact, it can work. Because up until now, there's been no Arab country in which an Islamic movement has come to power democratically and tested this thesis of whether or not Islam and democracy are compatible. Yes, we know Turkey, that's not Arab. We know Indonesia, that's not Arab. We know Malaysia, that's not Arab. And sometimes it's even Bangladesh, depending on the particular year when that military coup hasn't taken place. These are large Muslim countries. So given that, everyone is looking at Tunisia. Now, the new phenomenon that I observed, and that if you've been following events, you may be familiar with it because it's happening in Egypt as well, is a Salafist movement. Now, the Salafist movement, without getting into the origin of the term and the different meanings that is associated with it over time, represents the real extremist of the Islamic movement. They do want alcohol banned. They don't want tourists from Europe. Let the tourists come from Algeria and Libya. Let fellow Muslims come. And they want women to wear the burqa. In Tunisia, it's called the niqab, excuse me. And one of the shocking things, having gone to Tunisia over the last 40 years, is to see in the city Boussaid, which is one of the most popular touristic locations, very upper class outside of Tunis, as I mentioned. One of the days I was spending there, women after women were wearing the niqab. The niqab is full coverage except for the slit of the eyes. This is Tunisia. This is not Somalia. This is not the Taliban in Afghanistan. I don't know how else to dramatize the contrast that this serves. And they represent this Salafist tendency. And the Salafist tendency is pushing and really applying a great deal of pressure on the Ennahda party to become more and more Islamic in their policies. So they're being caught in the middle. The secular elites on their left, who are scared to death that they're going to lose all the privileges and rights that they had obtained over many decades. And now on their right are the Salafists, who are demanding that Sharia law be part of the Constitution, that every aspect of Islamic tradition and law be applied. And they become quite aggressive in their behavior. I was at the University of Manuba, which is one of the university towns. The law still disallows students with niqabs to attend classes. So women have to take it off if they want to come to class. They're not allowed. So, of course, as you can imagine, to make a point, to dramatize their point of view, and to challenge the regime, they send students into the classroom with niqabs on. And the dean came and said, you got to go. You can't stay. And you surely can't take exams, because we don't even know who you are. So, male Salafists came in and began to attack the dean. The dean calls the police. Now, just a few minutes ago, I talked about a police state. I talked about this incredible system of informants, the national security state that wasn't based on the military, but based on the intelligence services. What struck you immediately when you went to Tunisia now, there are no police anywhere. Police are gone. So if you call the police, they don't show up. In part, of course, is that under the old system, yes, they got paid, they didn't get paid well, but they made it up. Bribe after bribe, everywhere. Stop you on the highway, here's the ticket, no, pay for the tickets. You can imagine. So they did okay. So now we're living in a democracy. We have no police, no bribes. But I'm still living on the old salary with no additional monies. I'm not working. So no police. So he calls the police, nobody shows up. So what this does is increases the confidence and the aggressiveness, and we've witnessed it, of the Salafists. And there have been many incidents. There was the incident of the movie Persepolis that was shown on this independent Tunisian television station. One little clip had an image of the Prophet Muhammad. They closed it down, they threw the guy in jail. There was another issue of a Tunisian magazine that has on the cover a well-known German-Tunisian soccer player. He's dressed, but his beautiful model wife, German wife, is nude, but on the cover. But he's got his hand across her chest, so you really don't see anything. Boom, he goes to jail, the magazine is shut down. Then you have the incidents in Manuba. And so there's one incident after another, and therefore, what I walked into is what I think we're going to be witnessing more and more in each of these post-revolutionary situations in the Arab world. A clash of cultures, a clash of ideas and principles about how, in fact, political life needs to be organized. Never having had democracy in any of these countries in the last 50, 60 or more years, they now have to learn how to deal with each other, how to accept the very notion that you may disagree with someone, but that disagreement is worked out within the political process. That if you organize politically and run candidates and contest elections, and if you lose, you come back and do it again with the expectation that you will win. And if you had won before and you now lose, you have to have the expectation of stepping down. That notion is unheard of. So as I spoke to these various constituencies, the secularists and the Islamists, they hated each other. And this is Tunisia, a very sophisticated society. And it was very hard to bring them together with an understanding of this democracy that they fought for and successfully achieved requires now the greatest deal of understanding on however much you may disagree with the other's point of view, that you've got to at least be willing to accept it as long as it is expressed non-violently. And Tunisian history is one of non-violence. And even in the period of the overthrow, though less than 100 people died in that whole period. Well, I could keep talking for a long, long time on this, and we only have an hour, and I do want to give people an opportunity to ask questions, if not about Tunisia, about maybe related questions that come from the Tunisian experience. So, Ellen, do you want to take over the questions?
Yes, we have a question. I'm going to bring the microphone to you so it can be heard by everyone.
Thank you for that very provocative talk. I just was wondering from what you said, if democracy can't establish itself in Tunisia, it would seem as though it couldn't establish itself anywhere in that part of the world.
It's exactly it. And, when I tell people why Tunisia matters, even though it's not geostrategically important, has no oil, has no gas, and so forth, is if it doesn't work here, homogeneous population, no ethnic divisions, no religious divisions, no regional divisions to speak of, fairly educated, so on and so forth. And the Islam that we're talking about in power for now is moderate. Makes explicit the fact that it works with democracy. And they've demonstrated that both in their verbiage and in their behavior. So if it doesn't work there, I just can't imagine that it will work in Libya. Or that it will even work in Egypt, where the Muslim Brotherhood and the Anur, the Salafist version in Egypt, dominate the political landscape. I can't imagine that will happen in Yemen. So I think not only are we looking at Tunisia, but I think the whole Arab Muslim world is looking at Tunisia and seeing, in the way that Tunisia began this whole process in the Arab Spring, and then it spread to Egypt and Libya and Yemen and so forth, so too will the question that remains still a question for so many people: will Islam and democracy demonstrate itself behaviorally that it is compatible, not just rhetorically? That will be what Tunisia will show us. And if it doesn't show us that, you can quote Entelis and says, be pessimistic, guys. But if it succeeds, I think it will influence the thinking and even the behavior of others. Yeah.
In the beginning of the 21st century, the Turks had Kemal Ataturk, who brought the country into a modern state, made it somewhat secular, etc. Do you see anyone on the horizon in the Arab areas?
Very good question. When Habib Bourguiba came to power, he modeled himself on Ataturk. And for those of you who are all familiar with Ataturk, I mean, as you said, he was a modern secular leader who totally transformed the residue of the Ottoman Empire into a modern nation state, including everything from getting rid of the Arabic script and putting Latin script, secularizing society. What Bourguiba never did do, however, which Ataturk did, and the Turkish constitution still holds on to it. We'll have to wait and see that if it changes, because they're in the process of amending the constitution, but I doubt it. The Turkish constitution explicitly states of the separation of church and state. Turkey is a secular state, so says the Turkish constitution. No Arab constitution has ever said that, even under someone like Bourguiba. And the article number 1 of the original constitution of Tunisia, and one that's been amended over the years and will be amended again as they're writing a new one, says Tunisia is an Arab republic, its religion is Islam, and is a sovereign state. That's it. Turkey says Turkey is a secular state. And it would seem to me that that ended up being a major, major difference. A major difference. Now, interestingly enough, Bourguiba ended up making the same mistakes Ataturk did. Ataturk focused in on the urban elite. So it was the urban elite of Ankara and Istanbul that became modern and Ataturkist, while the bulk of the Turks in Anatolia will remain conservative, religious, in many ways traditional. And it's not accidental that the government in power today is an Islamic government in power. As thousands and thousands of Turks from the Anatolian plains over the years moved into the large cities of Turkey, and ultimately their ideology, their culture, their values became represented in the political movement. And the AKP party, which is an Islamic party, has been in power successfully for a number of years now, dominates the parliament, the president is a member, the prime minister is.
Yes, I have two questions. The first one's, this Arab Spring, it's a domino effect that we thought would continue to go on and so on. Do you see, between the Arabs and the Berbers, do you see a Wahhabi movement coming from Saudi Arabia taking over the Islamic movement? The second question, follow-up to that, would be, what happens to the minorities in these nations with the Islamists taking over?
Sure. Very good question. Now, I'm a little unclear about the first question because you mentioned Arab and Berber, then you mentioned Wahhabis, because those are two different kinds of issues. Now, in the case of Tunisia, Berbers, by the way, are the original inhabitants of North Africa. So when the Arab tribes from the Arabian Peninsula came and conquered North Africa in the 7th century, they Islamicized the people, but they didn't necessarily Arabize them. And even to this day, you have 20% of the Algerian population is of Berber origin, and over 50% of the Moroccan population, even though there's a lot of intermarriage. Tunisia doesn't have many Berbers left. I mean, so that's pretty insignificant in the case there. Now, Wahhabism is Salafism. So the Wahhabist influence is reflected in the Salafist movement. And the Wahhabists, this is the dominant religious power in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have for decades funded their particular vision and version of Islam through the building of mosques, availability of textbooks, and so forth. When I was teaching at the University of Algiers, I was innocent at the time in the 1970s. I was teaching at an institute that also included a lot of Egyptians because Algerians had been colonized for such a long time they didn't even know their own language. So Egyptians had to come to Algeria to teach them Arabic. How sad is that by the impact of colonialism? Only later did I find out that almost all these Egyptian teachers were Wahhabists. They were actually members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they taught him Arabic. They also taught him the Quran and the way you should look at life. And I'm sort of hanging out with them at department meetings. Oh, I like these guys, and so forth. Innocent American, what do I know? Later on to find out, wow. So the influence has been evident. It's evident, and it's reflected in the Salafists. The Salafists' funding ideology is Wahhabist. The second question was the... Yeah, the minorities are very, very important part. Now, in the case of Tunisia, we don't have really minorities. The Jewish community, which is one of the oldest communities in the world, and the synagogue on the island of Jerba is one of the oldest, if not the oldest synagogue still functioning in the world. But in terms of percentages, in terms of numbers, there's hardly any minority to speak of in Tunisia. And that's why, again, we go back why Tunisia mattered, because here's a case where it is relatively homogenous. So if it doesn't work under a homogenous situation, what does it happen in a place like where 10% of the population is Coptic, like in Egypt? Or where you have a place like Iraq, or a place like Lebanon, or Syria for that matter, all these minorities, right? I mean, in this case, I think the proof will be in the pudding and the eating of the pudding on the part of the Islamists. In the case of Tunisia, the challenge is not that big because there are not many minorities. In the case of Egypt, talking to my Coptic friends, they are scared. And they are leaving in very large numbers on a monthly basis. The one figure I've heard is 1,000 Copts are leaving Egypt at least every month. Now, you know, if that continues at this rate, I mean, there's about 8 to 10 million Copts in a population of 80, 85 million in Egypt. So you have Sunni Muslims and Coptic Christians. That's scary. That's scary. But are they leaving because the Islamists have done something specific in their policy and their behavior to make them fearful, or are they projecting what they've always felt about the Islamists, that you can't trust them, that they're scary, and so on and so forth? See, until Tunisia and Egypt, our understanding of Islamists in the Arab world has been that they've been the bad guys. We've thought of terrorism, we've thought of Wahhabism, and the idea of moderate Islamists, compatible with democracy, we're used to the language, but we didn't witness it anywhere in practice. So now the practice. Now, admittedly, as you know, before Mubarak was overthrown, there have been serious clashes between Copts and Muslims. Coptic churches have been burned, but then mosques have been burned as well. But when you have those incidents, you've got to be very careful. You've got to go and investigate situation by situation. Sometimes it's over land. Sometimes it's a family squabble. Sometimes it's, revenge killings and so forth. In other words, is it a religious war, or is it a personal war, an economic war, a territorial war, a region, so on and so forth. So, one has to sort of step back. But regardless, it's like when Algeria became independent and the European inhabitants of Algeria that had been living there for generations, they fled en masse at independence, not because the Algerians in power were threatening them, but they just simply, viewed that they would do to us what we've been doing to them for 130 years. Let's get out of here, get on a boat and go. And they all, like 90% of them left, 95%. So there's that fear that they will project in their pre-existing fears, in part justified, but I think also imagined, they will exit prematurely. But who knows? Yeah.
So, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Would you,
Yeah.
I wonder if you would make the argument of those who feel that democracy and Islam are compatible.
Yeah, I'm one, I didn't list my name among the people, but I am one of those people who have long argued that it has been compatible. And to be honest with you, the example I use is not even Tunisia. I use the case of Algeria. Algeria in 1988 experienced the first intifada, the first democratic revolution, when people took to the streets by the thousands and forced the military to come in and shoot and kill them, then backed off and amended the Constitution. This was a classic one-party Marxist-Leninist state until that moment. And it went from being a one-party Marxist-Leninist state into a multi-party democratic state with free, fair elections, which took place in 1990. And Islamists won big time. People, who don't follow this didn't realize it. At that time, the world got spooked out because they were imagining Iran. Oh my God, another 1979. We can't have that. But the government allowed the process to go forward. There were parliamentary elections. There were 2 rounds. The first round, the Islamist Party wins again. It's on the verge of winning the majority of seats in the parliament in the second round when the military stages a coup, supported by Washington and Paris, because we're spooked out with the idea of, so this is way before this. This is 1991. And when the army came in, not only did it kill thousands of people, it destroyed the opportunity to determine whether Islam and democracy in an Arab context could work, because that's when it first began. Not only did they stop that process, but a civil war ensued that lasted for over 10 years and 200,000 people were killed, almost all Algerians. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, in explaining, well, why hasn't Algeria followed Libya, Egypt, Tunisia? It's in the neighborhood. That's one of the reasons. They think back at that legacy and they look at what's happening in Syria and says, we've already had 200,000 people killed. They've only had 8,000 people killed in Syria. So that's held them back. So I argue both theoretically and empirically that There's nothing inherent in Islam that makes it incompatible. And the evidence is the Turkey, the Indonesias, the Bangladeshis, and sometimes the Pakistans. Again, it goes back and forth. So the real question, that's why Tunisia is going to be interesting. It's not, are Islam and democracy incompatible? Is Arab society and democracy incompatible? That's the question you need to look at here. Because since we don't have a democracy in the Arab world, we're just now witnessing it, that's going to be it. Because we have too many other examples where Islam and democracy work outside the Arab world. So, and I gave the example of Algeria, and maybe Tunisia will go. So the question is, will Arab society, based on culture, history, and everything else, be able to adapt to a democratic political system or not? That's to be determined. Those are the events of the future. And that's what we need to be looking at more closely today. That it comes in the form of an Islamist party, that's less important. Because these are Tunisian party members. Arabic speaking, and because of Islam, of its totalistic character, it's understandable that they would pick those belief systems that serve best to mobilize the largest number of people. Socialism doesn't do that. Liberalism doesn't do that. Other kinds of Western secular ideologies have long failed to mobilize these people. Islam does that. Thus, it makes sense that political Islam serve as the instrument for democratization. Where are we? Oh, I'm sorry, yep.
Could you tell us what you think of how King Mohammed is handling it in Morocco?
Sure, very good question. I study all three countries. I know all these, and I know Mohammed VI quite well. He used to live in New Jersey. I'm from New Jersey, so that's. And he got himself into a lot of trouble. This is the current king in Morocco, by the way. Because he used to have all these wild parties and in Bernardsville, and they all got don't mess up the neighborhood. What's going on? Just because you're a king, he's a prince. He was a crown prince at the time. He never wanted to be king. He did not want to be king. He still doesn't want to be king. And Morocco is one where the usual metaphor that we use is the glass is half full, half empty. I'm of the school, it's half empty. Not because I don't like Morocco, I love Morocco and so forth, a whole bunch of stuff. But I think what he's trying to do is what these other regimes have been trying to do for 50 years and have all failed. In other words, just throw crumbs at the people, shut them up, and let's go back to business as usual. The fact of the matter is the king of Morocco is a dictator, plain and simple. He runs the show. He is the commander of the faithful. No matter what else he does, the parliament means nothing, parties hardly mean anything. Now, for those who think the glass is half full, as you said, these reforms in light of the Arab Spring, well, it looks like the king is, responding appropriately, things are, but the reality is, and this is not me just saying that, Moroccans will tell you, they'll say, this is a country that has no oil, no gas, one of the poorest countries in North Africa. There's incredible disparities of wealth. Power is concentrated in the monarchy, way out of proportion to the size of the country and the demands of the country. So until such time that the monarch is willing to make Morocco a constitutional monarchy a la Spain, Sweden, England, it remains autocratic. And if it remains autocratic, it is vulnerable to the same challenges that Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Syria have experienced. Well, these are the good Islamists that he has under control. This is known as co-optation. You take the Islamist, and then you make them the prime minister, but you hold all the power. And then people say, well, look, we let Islamists in, so leave me alone. They're not going to leave them alone. The country's too poor, too many discontented people. Still a beautiful place. I encourage you to go visit Marrakesh, go to Fez, great places. Yep.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I have two questions. Sure. One is you kind of accentuate the cultural issues and cultural divides, and so where do you see the economy playing a role here in terms of who is controlling the purse, who has economic power, and economically disenfranchised, and how do they react, and Annahta, how it responds to that. And the other question actually which came up after your response to some of the questions, I'm really puzzled when you pose the question of compatibility of Arab culture with democracy. It is a bit more understandable if you pose the question in terms of religion, because it's a worldview understood differently by Muslims. Of course, there are multiple Islam conceptualization, but the Arabism, that is in terms of, can we really essentialize an Arab worldview and culture that you can put as in terms of compatibility terms?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I didn't want to essentialize and orientalize this at all, and I'm very sensitive to that notion. But, you know, and having to sort of answer quickly, you sort of throw out just, you know, key words. And I didn't use culture because I wanted to avoid, I said Arab, I don't know, society, something, but it's on tape, so they'll have whatever I said. No, it's, you know what it is? It's simply, it's a kind of empirical question that confronts you when you've eliminated all the other options. The reason the Islamic dimension is put aside because there are too many other Islamic countries that are democratic. So Islam has got to be, you know, removed as a possible explanation because there are too many Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries that are democratic. Because, as you said, when you introduce Islam, you're talking about culture. And culture doesn't change easily. So if you're a Muslim living in Paris and you're a Muslim living in Bronxville, if you are so culturally predetermined to be against democracy, you are in Bronxville equally against democracy as you are in Marrakesh, because you're Muslim. Doesn't hold water. Doesn't hold water. Behaviorally, we know Muslims in India, one of the third largest Muslim population in the world is in India. They're 10% of the population. You know, they vote. They go to vote. They vote all over the place. So it's not Islam. So then we look and we say, well, the only region of the world that democracy is absent is in the Arabic-speaking world. So leave it as Arabic-speaking. Leave culture aside. So from a political science or social scientist point of view, it's a puzzle. You use the word puzzle. It's a puzzle that needs investigation. I don't know the answer, but I think one of the ways in which a partial answer will emerge is the degree to which a place like Tunisia becomes democratic. Lebanon was a case that was always used in the past. For those of you who are at all familiar with Lebanon. Oh, but Lebanon was democracy. I think everybody's pretty much given up that. Lebanon is a great place, Lebanese food is fantastic, Beirut is beautiful, and all that. But as far as Lebanese democracy, you know, that's a hard case to make. That's it. That's it. There's no other place. So, you know, I wouldn't use the word culture. I would just simply say, in the Arabic-speaking world, the political systems in which Arabs are the majority, there is no democracy. We are now witnessing in the Arab Spring the overthrow of the dictatorships. Step number one. Step number two is the transitioning to some more open, participatory kind of government. Step number three will be the institutionalization of democracy. If it happens in places like Tunisia and Egypt and so forth, that takes care of the essentialism, the culture out the window. We're done. The Arab world is no more exceptional about its authoritarianism or its democracy than anywhere else. But until that happens, it lends itself to this kind of questioning, which is unfortunate because, you know, it inevitably degenerates into all kinds of stereotypes and cultural biases and the way we've developed with Islam. I mean, until you have to convince people that, you know, the majority of Muslims in the world live in democracies. That's a factual statement. I'm not making this up. It means all the Muslims in America, Canada, Europe, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Turkey, you add them all up. I mean, the majority. So anyone that tries to make a case that Muslims are incompatible with democracy, the facts deny that. The facts deny that. But in the Arab world, the facts are on the other side. So that's what you know, we want to investigate. The economics is a very good question, but maybe we'll have to answer that another time.
Thank you. This has been... Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yep.
Wanted to find out, how should America react to this? Is there any role at all, or is this something that has to be handled by each country separately?
Yeah, Yeah, I guess that's the $64,000 question. I mean, I don't know where people's political proclivities are here, but I'm pretty happy with the way Obama has dealt with things, believe it or not. I was in Tunisia at the time he was giving his Cairo speech. This is the one he gave, a couple of years ago. And it got an enormous positive response in the Arab world. Then the Arab Spring, emerged. My sense is the less we do, the better. Less we do, the better. And to be honest with you, they're happy with that. That is, the Arab countries are happy with that. Just keep your hands off. Now, the fact that Hillary Clinton just approved this $1.3 billion military aid to Egypt, that didn't go down well. Didn't go down well here. It didn't go down well in Egypt. Because the aid is going to the military. The military is the group that is preventing for democracy from coming. Now, maybe in certain policy circles in Washington, they're getting scared about the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafist wing. And then maybe they're viewing the military as a natural obstacle. This reminds me of Algeria, when Washington and Paris supported the coup against the Islamic Party that won elections in 1991. So, on one hand, there's, like the case of Tunisia, we've had a hands-off policy. But then people say, yeah, because Tunisia has no geostrategic significance. We can afford to be moral. We can afford to advance democracy. Egypt is important. The peace treaty with Israel, the Suez Canal, it's the largest country in the Arab world. We have long-standing, military-to-military ties. They support us in our war against terrorism, whatever that is, and da-da-da-da-da. So, I can understand the tendency to continue to, interject ourselves in the Egyptian case, but I really do think it's counterproductive, and I think it's creating a amount of a resentment that we don't need, particularly when we were viewed very favorably in the beginning of the Arab Spring, that this was done spontaneously by the people themselves. Of course, the NATO bombardment in Libya, that didn't go down all that well. So you can see it's getting complicated. It's getting complicated because now we now understand that while Tunisia began it, the autocrats all fell, we think democracy is all going to come, we now, I think, realize that as we look at every country, it has very distinctive features. Libya is not Tunisia, and Egypt is not Libya, and Yemen is not Egypt. I mean, they are very, very different. So the only thing they had in common, they were all autocrats. The other thing is they overthrew the autocrats. The hope is they will become democratic. Those are the large-scale uniformities. But between all of that is enormous differences and diversities that need to be understood and appreciated. And hopefully the United States government is sophisticated enough in understanding the need to nuance each of these on their own terms. Otherwise, we're back to square one.
Three more questions. Start one here, and I'll do two over on that side of the room.
Thank you.
Your thoughts on the conflict between the Sunni and the Shiites with the axis of Iraq, Iran versus Saudi Arabia and the Arab Peninsula? Yeah.
Well, you guys are asking the big questions here. Just hanging out with Tunisia seemed easy. Iraq. What can I say? I mean, going back to the question of minorities, you can't have a better example than the situation in Iraq. With the Sunni Shiites and the Kurds, and the fact that colonialism created this artificial entity called Iraq in the first place. And the invasion of Iraq, of course, made things worse, not better. Especially now, if we look back, would Saddam have fallen the way the other dictators have fallen? No way of knowing this in advance. But it's hard to believe that he would have, if Ben Ali went down the tube, if Gaddafi went down the tube, Mubarak went down the tube, Assad is about to go down the tube, why wouldn't have Saddam Hussein gone down the tube, I would have thought. But anyway, there was no way of projecting in advance. No, I mean, when you look at the case in Iraq, this is a country that suffers from multiple legacies, historical legacies, colonial legacies, exploitation, go back to the economic factors. It has the misfortune of having oil. We know for a fact that if you have oil, you suffer. If you have oil, you don't have democracy. If you have oil, you're underdeveloped, not developed, unless you're, Kuwait or Abu Dhabi, but they don't count. The big countries of the world. So Iraq has suffered occupation, colonial legacy, ethnic divisions, artificial boundaries, rentier economy, and now caught in this vice that it is with Shiite Iran, with very much trying to influence the Maliki government, which Maliki himself lived for years in Iran. He speaks fluent Persian. And then you have the Alawite, which is an offshoot of Shiism in Damascus, and the fear on the part of the Saudis, because you mentioned the Sunnis. Visualize a map of the Middle East, and if you start to visualize, a kind of Sunni-Shiite conflict, that we don't like to think in these terms, but I wonder if the people in the area are thinking in these terms. If you begin with Iran, that's Shiite. You move to Iraq, majority Shiite. You go to Syria, Alawite, minority, but it's a Shiite. You move down to Lebanon, where Hezbollah is the strongest, Shiite party, the strongest. And then you go down to Bahrain, which is majority Shiite. And then along the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia, it's Shiite. So they say, well, God, look at this crescent, this Shiite crescent. Now, having just given you that, step back, don't get over, this is what the government does all the time, say, oh, look at that way, and so forth. But, from the point of view of the Saudis, or the Sunni government in Bahrain, or the Sunnis in Syria, or the Sunnis in Iraq, they do see this crescent as not as a kind of hypothetical, meaningless, religious, uniformity, but as a political and military threat. If that's how they feel, then they're going to act on those feelings, however, objectively inaccurate that might be. That is, inaccurate in the belief that just because they're Shiites, that they're automatically hostile. Because, Iran is the problem not because of Shiism, because of the form of government it has. So I've never bought into the fundamental religious nature of these conflicts. I don't even buy into the Coptic Muslim one. Yes, religion's part of it, but I think it's political and economic. As I did my dissertation in Lebanon, and I did a study of the Maronites in Lebanon, and it became clear to me that religion was used as a justification to advance economic privileges and political opportunity. So the Maronites were on top, they're the Catholics, and the Shiites were at the bottom, economically. So it was inevitable that the Shiites would sooner or later, in the name of Shiism, through Hezbollah, mobilize to challenge those that had the economic and political power. But it was made out to be as, it's Shiites against Maronites, or Shiites and so forth. And same in Iraq. The reason the Shiites in Iraq are so upset, they've been the majority for so long, but they've been the impoverished majority. The Sunnis under Saddam Hussein, they were the privileged ones. So I view it more, maybe it's a kind of Marxist analysis, but I view it more as a class conflict that articulates itself in religious terms because that's the way in which you can mobilize people. So if you use Hezbollah as an example, use Bahrain. Bahrain is governed by a Sunni minority and a Shiite majority. And the Sunni minority has all the power, economic, political, and everything else. And the majority of the population is poor. You go to Bahrain, and you think Bahrain, we have the Fifth Fleet there, there's a monarchy, it used to have oil, but it's rather... They're slums, they're ghettos. And who lives in the ghettos? Shiites. So, I don't think it takes much imagination to argue along class and economic lines rather than Shiite-Sunni when you have impoverishment in Bahrain, when you have impoverishment in Iraq, in Lebanon, and of which Shiism is used as a mobilization agent.
Okay, one more quick question, because we're running out of time tonight.
I just have one question about some of the young people, sort of the students that might be
Yes.
returning to the area from overseas,
Right.
whether the United States, the Harvard, Stanfords, the Fordhams, for instance. Are they going into the countryside to sort of mobilize the way the Muslim Brotherhood did in Egypt and the Islamists did in Tunisia?
Excellent question, because I asked that of the students. Because as I said earlier, the students led these revolutions. You saw it in Tahrir Square, you saw it on Avenue Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia. It was the youth. It was very obvious it was young people. So now you go to Tunisia, and I talked to the students and said, well, what have you been doing, you know? First of all, they didn't go vote. They didn't vote. They didn't go and vote. Sounds like the U.S. I mean, you know, total political apathy. I said, well, you didn't vote. Well, you know, whatever. You know, they decided not to vote. In other words, they already stepped back. And the elected officials of this constituent assembly and this new cabinet in Tunisia is made up of the old guard. The interim president is 88 years old. The incumbent president is 70. Now, we don't want to talk about age here because we're in good company. Age is good. But if the majority of the population is under 35, and those ruling them are over 75, and you are the ones that sacrificed your life to go to the barricades and cause the revolution, and then, you know, so there's a great deal of disillusionment on the part of youth in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere. And they've got to start to understand that this is a new ball game now. If you really think you're in a democratic moment, that means you organize politically. And I had meetings with students. I said, you've got to volunteer. You've got to find your candidate. You've got to find your issues. You've got to go out from house to house and begin to, but this is new to them. This is new to them. So this is a very good question. There's been a huge gap between the youth that made the revolution and the youth that now feel disillusioned and disenchanted and are not willing to participate. And they've got to, otherwise, you know, we may come back full circle and discontent and marginalization. Ellen, is that it? Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that. Thank you. Oh, you're up here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's clear why you won that award. You were recognized by your students and colleagues. Your passion is obvious. I thank you. As Director of Community Relations, I want to take this opportunity to thank our community of scholars who made tonight possible. First, our speaker, Dr. Entelis. And I want to thank Kate Jacobson for her sponsorship of this. Is Kate here? I know she is, but if you just stand up, Kate, so everyone, for her sponsorship of this program. And I want to thank Mandana and Sherry Fraser for their guidance. And I also want to thank Chris Alexander from Davidson College, who made the connection to Dr. Entelis. So he's not here, but I just want to make it known that he did help us, and I want to thank him. So we're privileged to learn from these scholars and benefit from their passion and their capacity for sharing that passion to inform and inspire us. And before I bid you good night, at 7 p.m. on the 25th of April, Brooke Johnson, the president of the Food Network, will be speaking at Krenz Center. Again, my sincere thanks to Dr. Entelis, and I thank you all. Good night.